And here we go. Hello, everybody that's arriving in our Zoom room, and welcome. I'm just going to take a moment to let people through. We are very sad that we're not in real life for this event. We're in the Zoom life, but it is a very dismal, rainy night in Brisbane. So if you are joining us from elsewhere, imagine that we're all kind of huddled together on the back deck trying to keep the rain out. And that would be your visual for the alternative event tonight. So luckily we are all inside, dry and happy tonight. So I'm going to start the event tonight by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we meet. In this area, the Yagara and the Turrbal people, and I'd like to pay my deepest respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to any other elders who are here tonight. I'd also like to acknowledge that because this is on Zoom, that we are zooming out onto the lands of many, many different Aboriginal people all around Australia. And I'd like to pay my respects to the elders of the land that you're joining me from as well. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land, and sovereignty was never ceded. So tonight, what we're going to be doing is we'll be having a little bit of a chat, and then after that chat, you guys are all going to be on mute, by the way. After that chat, we will have a chance to ask questions, and Lucy will answer some of your questions. And just to make that happen, I'm going to show you where you can ask those questions by popping that in the chat link. The link to, so the chat link is going to pop up now, and the link that I've put in there is actually the link to the book. I think it's got a little bit of extra coding on the end of there, so I will resend that link because it seems to have gone a bit awry in the translation, but I'll resend the link to the book as the chat is happening tonight, and that is going to be where you can put your you can have the conversation and questions about the book tonight. So that is all great. So without further ado, I'm going to start the event, and I'm going to introduce you to the wonderful Sally Piper, who is going to take over and be our interloculator tonight. I don't think I said that right, but Sally will correct me when she's on. Sally Piper is the award-winning author of Grace's Table, The Geography of Friendship, and the forthcoming very exciting novel, Bone Memories, which will be out next year, and I can't wait to read it. She has written short fiction and non-fiction for publications including the Griffith Review, the Saturday Paper, the Sydney Morning Herald, and the Weekend Australian. I'd love everybody to welcome the wonderful Sally Piper. Welcome, Sally.
Thanks, Chrissy. Thank you. And I actually don't know how to pronounce that word either.
I shouldn't have said it.
Interlocutor.
Oh, thank you, Lucy.
Thank you. Somebody else can correct me if I've got it wrong.
I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land where I am this evening, which is the Turrbal and Yagara people, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I'd also like to thank First Nations people everywhere for their careful custodianship of these lands for which sovereignty was never ceded, and to express my deep sorrow and regret that the same care hasn't been afforded the land since colonisation. And now, Lucy Neave, it's so nice to meet you. Can't believe you've grown up in so many places, Australia, Toronto, London and Kathmandu. And you've spent several years living in the United States, first as a Fulbright scholar, completing a Master of Fine Arts in Writing, then teaching English in universities, and in 2019 as a visiting scholar in the English department of New York University, sorry. Lucy's first novel, Who We Were, was shortlisted for the ACT Book of the Year. Her short fiction has been published in a range of Australian and American literary journals and in Best Australian Stories. And she was awarded a Griffith Review Novella Prize in 2018. and now Lucy teaches creative writing at the Australian National University, where she is Associate Dean of Student Experience. That's something I'd like to talk about at some stage at another venue. And now you have given us this beautiful book, absolutely extraordinary book, Believe in Me, which traverses the lives of a mother and her daughter from 1974 through to 2004. And the story begins with Sarah, an 18-year-old girl from upstate New York, and it follows her first to a small town in Idaho where she travels as companion to an evangelical preacher, and then to Australia where she is exiled into an unmarried mother's home at the behest of her mother. And there Sarah defiantly fights to keep her baby and then sets out to build the best life she can for them in this strange new land. Sarah's daughter Bette is the omniscient narrator of Sarah's life, which she tries to reconstruct by drawing on her memories, interpreting anecdotes her mother might have told her, and from the scrapbooks Sarah's kept, and which are filled with images, souvenirs, and fragments from her life. The story is really rich in imagery and metaphor, many biblical references and allusions, as it definitely explores themes of identity, love, spiritual entrapment, and the unknowability of others. And there is so much more in this book to unpack as well. But before we start talking about the book, Lucy, I wondered if we could first talk a little about you and how you came to be in the United States for all those exciting things that you did there, and how the time you spent living there might have influenced the writing of this story.
Thanks, Sally. Thanks for the introduction. I just want to acknowledge that I'm on the land of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and just to pay my respects to elders past and present, and also just to acknowledge that, you know, that the land and the people who've lived here have a long tradition of storytelling that I feel a lot of respect for. So in terms of my time spent in the US, and although my biography says that I've lived in all these exciting and fun places, in most cases it wasn't for a long period of time. But the US was a bit different in that, although I think the longest I've ever lived there has been, at a stretch, has been 3 years. I've spent quite a lot of time there on and off, really since I was in my teens. So I went on an exchange when I was 17, and then, which is about the same age as Sarah, the mother in the novel. And then I returned to, actually when I was at university for 10 weeks, and then I went back and did a graduate degree for a couple of years. And then I kept going back, actually, on when I had maternity leave, or you know, if I had other kind of things that I could do there, like, for example, study leave. And I guess there's something about the US that I've always found very, very interesting. The people that you meet in the US are often extremely warm and welcoming and accepting of, you know, where you've come from, and apparently curious. And I have really close friendships with a number of people in the US who also write. But at the same time, there's this, so that on the one hand, there's this sort of interpersonal warmth that you get often from people who are American, but at the same time, there's also these really incongruous and uncomfortable aspects of American culture that I've often found fascinating. Obviously, you know, the things that have happened in the last couple of years around race, but also around women's reproductive rights, and also about the treatment of people, you know, the lack of the social safety net, and the kind of horror that I guess, you know, I was with small children sometimes in the US, and I would feel as though it was not a place that you could necessarily wanted your kids to grow up there, because you'd feel that if anything went wrong, they wouldn't have the sort of support that they would get in Australia. And so I think that a lot of, both of my books are interested partly in the relationship between the US and Australia, but also partly in that strange incongruity between interpersonal warmth and friendship that's often offered by Americans, but also the way that they treat each other and they treat other parts of the world. And I think sometimes in travels across the US too, you know, I've mostly spent time in urban centres where there's a really different different way of life to people living in the country, which is something that I was interested in this book as well, in that the main character, one of the main characters, Sarah, spends quite a lot of time in remote parts of Idaho. So I hope that answers your question somewhat, Sally.
Yeah, it's very vividly depicted that period of time that she spends there as well. In your acknowledgements in the book, you say you owe a great debt to Marilyn Robinson's wonderful book, Housekeeping, and she's got that whole fantastic trilogy of small town, Middle America, I guess, is where it's located. And I was wondering, was American literature like Robinson's what drew you to writing your own version of small town America, and including this aspect of religious fanaticism, really, that is what it is? Or were there other literary influences as well?
So Marilyn Robinson's book, Housekeeping, and it really is housekeeping and not the later books that I was I wasn't as intrigued by them, although they also have religious characters. They have quite religious characters in the later books as well. But Robinson's book, Housekeeping, is set in a place called Fingerbone in her book, but it's based on the place that she grew up, which is Sandpoint, which is the location that Sarah lives in the novel. So Housekeeping is very much about women, and it's about the lives of women, and it's really interesting in that it unlike a lot of American novels where the hero kind of overcomes obstacles, in this book there's a kind of tight-knit relationship between two sisters and an aunt called Sylvie, and then eventually one of the sisters drifts away, but there's no sort of affirming heroism in the novel. Instead, what ends up happening, if you haven't read the book, I highly recommend it, is that Sylvie and Ruth get on a train basically, and the plan is that they're going to ride boxcars through the US. So they sort of become homeless, and they become almost a lot of what's interesting in the novel is about the relationship between these characters and the natural world. So the lake in Fingerbone plays a really large role, and I guess the part of the novel that's set in Sandpoint is part homage to Robinson, but it's also in that book where there's probably one male character of any significance who's a judge who's sort of threatening to take the kids away from Sylvie. I guess I admire the feminism of Robinson's novel in a sense, but at the same time, my novel's much more about the effects of living in a world which is really ruled by men and by the patriarchy, and in a sense it's also a reality check in some senses. I'd never want to argue with Marilyn Robinson because she's an incredible writer, but it is partly that as well. And in terms of other work that was really influential, I think the Irish writer Anne Enright's The Gathering, and Enright's work. Also, I'm just really interested in trying to evoke things in a kind of, I guess you'd say, a poetic way, and some of Enright's works like that. And then the other book that a friend of mine reminded me was really useful to me was a book which is very different, much more contemporary, by Maggie Nelson, called The Argonauts, which is it's a fusion between theory but also kind of autobiography, and it's about living with someone who's trans or occupying a space that's not, she's living with a character who doesn't really use pronouns but calls themselves Harry, I'm pretty sure, from memory. And it's about that relationship and about their family.
Well, you've certainly developed your own unique and authentic voice in this one, even though you've drawn on those others. It's a really distinctive story that you've written here. And a particular interest with religion and the power of it, I must admit. And Sarah's relationship with God and the church filters into much of her thinking and directs many of her actions. But this relationship is often saboteur as much as it is saviour for her right throughout her life, really. And Bette, who is Sarah's daughter, who is retelling her mother's story in the book, asks of herself in relation to examining her mother's religious beliefs. She says, "How do I write about a religious fervour I don't feel?" But I often thought, was it religious fervour that Sarah had, or was it the expectation that she live up to the religious fervour of other people and to try and understand it? Has she been born into it, whether she likes it or not?
Yeah, so I think for Sarah, the church is a structure that, that, or at least, the church itself, but also the kind of the beliefs of the people around her serve as sort of a scaffolding or a structure on which she cannot imagine existing without. But I guess in many respects, our lives, there are all these structures in our lives that we don't necessarily think about on a conscious level, and which are really hard to kind of contest or challenge. And for Sarah, the church and kind of, the fact that she's living in an era which is quite patriarchal, like those two things are almost inseparable, I think, in the book and in Sarah's life. And I agree that I don't think that she is so much fervently religious as unable to kind of separate herself from those sort of forms in a life, in a way. And at the same time that I suppose, but there's also a sort of what intrigued me in writing the book, because I'm not at all religious, I'm sort of more like Bette, was that I did use the Bible quite a lot, because I find that, if you look up anything, like as in, what do you do if you're feeling jealous? Say you look up jealousy, or you look up adultery or something, you can find all of these references to the Bible that sort of give you like directives, but also the language of the Bible's really, really beautiful in places. And so both of those things together, I think Sarah also acknowledges the kind of the poetry or the beauty in the language in the Bible too, as well as the, while being unable to fully separate herself from the structure that it's placed her within, in a way. Yeah, I hope that answers your question.
No, it does. That's interesting. Yeah, and it's a patriarchal structure that still exists today, really, isn't it? There's not a lot changed since the 1970s. Yeah. I felt that in many ways Sarah's faith failed to prepare her for the real world, because it placed simplistic and naive expectations on her, such as that being good and praying often was her greatest salvation, but it failed to take into account human flaws and weaknesses and the easy willingness for exploitation. And it's a naivety that Isaiah, the minister she accompanies to Idaho, is more than happy to exploit. But of those exploitations, Sarah says it feels godly, right? And it's as though she believes if Isaiah's actions were wrong, then God wouldn't have let it happen. And then later, chillingly, Isaiah says, remember, we must be good servants of the church. To do that, we must forget everything we might wish to remember, which just sent a shiver up my spine when I read that. And I wonder if you could tell us a bit about your thoughts behind Isaiah. He's not a likable character, but he is a complex character. And I just wondered if you could talk a bit about the development of that character when you were writing your book.
Yeah, that's a good question, because I think what's interesting about a lot of the characters is the way that the book is written. It's also all imagined from Bette's perspective. So you don't actually have, as a reader, you never have unimpeded access necessarily to a character, but you have sort of access at one remove from Isaiah and from Sarah too, because this is all, although Sarah seems to be her own person, she's also very much filtered through the imagination of Bette. And in some ways, I think Isaiah is perhaps more archetypally who he is, because he's been imagined by somebody who never met him. So he's a kind of he's perhaps in some ways how you would imagine a religious, an evangelical preacher. But at the same time, I didn't want him to be entirely unsympathetic. He does some things which are really without giving a game away, which are really terrible. But at the same time, there's a recognition, at least on Sarah's part, through that this is all filtered, but that he also, there are reasons for his desperation, I suppose. And so I never, although the the male characters in the book, not all of them are unsympathetic, but some of them are, I'm hopeful that they are also not black and white in any way, that they, that there's aspects to their character that maybe don't explain what they did, why they did what they did, but at least you can imagine why. Yeah.
There's none of these characters are stereotypical. I think all of them are so deeply crafted. It's one of the great joys of reading the book is the uniqueness of the characters that inhabit the story. Sarah is in many ways possessed first by God. Then she has a number of relationships with men, some of whom make claims of wanting to save her in God's name, which perpetuates further her almost innate sense of duty to God and a duty to these men who end up trying to possess her too. And I found the comparisons that could be drawn in the story between this religious fanaticism and domestic coercive control quite frightening. And is that a comparison something that you intended, or is that just me bringing one reader's perspective to the story, I guess?
Yeah, I think it's a really good observation, because I probably was not necessarily connecting those two things while I was writing. But again, it's that sort of interest in these kind of structures within which we exist, which we don't always completely see. And I've had two sort of readers' responses to the kind of the coercive control aspect of the book, and one was why did you have to do that to Sarah, like she'd had a really tough time already, and then the other one, which was from actually my mother-in-law, who I don't think is here, was I found it so realistic. It's exactly what women's lives were like, through the 70s and 80s. So I found that those responses, which I don't think it's fully answering your question, but I found those responses really kind of interesting, that it was, that there was an aspect. I think, we think of because this book is set, from the early 70s onwards, we think of that time as a time where, there was at least, feminism was a thing. But at the same time, the kind of the reproductive freedoms that women began to have in the 1970s actually facilitated forms of oppression that were different perhaps from in the 50s and 60s, or it was okay to be sort of sexually oppressive in some ways.
When Sarah arrives in Sydney as a naive pregnant 18-year-old, we're abruptly confronted with how alien and frightening this foreign landscape is. And even to me as an Australian, I could feel that visceral response she had at just being confronted by this completely different place. And then, of course, especially her terror of being placed in a home for unmarried mothers. But one of the great things about this book is that you also gift us hope and joy during this and other difficult times throughout the story, and because it just helps with the brevity of it and lifts us up. And hope comes at this point in Sarah's life through the beautifully crafted character of Dora, a socialist feminist who befriends Sarah. And in many ways, I felt Dora was like Sarah's alter ego. She's the person she could have been, who refused the restrictions of the patriarchy, but which she never really sort of opted into. And that's because I'm not really sure that she wanted to be like Dora either, because Dora sort of sat at the end of the spectrum of 1970s feminism, and then Sarah sat right at the other end. And I guess I wanted you to talk about Dora and whether she really was a beacon of hopeful possibility, or was she just another extreme character, extreme person in Sarah's life, like her faith was. I just wondered if you could talk about Dora.
Yeah, I think Dora's a kind of interesting character, because she sort of showed up she's a nurse, and she's also, she has a kind of moral core, or, you know, she has a kind of an ethics, but at the same time she's also very determinedly herself, in that she's not interested in getting married. Her relationships are with women. She's a lesbian from the 70s onwards. I mean, she talks about perhaps having had relationships with men prior to that time. And she's also an atheist, so she's very different in terms of her religious approach to the world. And at the same time, she's able to, you know, I don't want to talk too much about this, but she's able to get Sarah out of a really tight spot, which is not something that many people are able to bring themselves to do. If you think about how much, you know, some of us might want to help, say, refugee families, or help people who are in real difficulty because we don't agree with the way they're treated. Dora actually does something that's very brave and puts herself at quite a lot of risk, and she does it quite lightly. She's really courageous. And so as an author, I feel quite a lot of admiration for Dora, actually, even though, you know, I suppose I wrote her. And at the same time, her lifestyle and the way she views the world is not something that Sarah feels that she can emulate. It's almost too late for Sarah by this time to change the way she lives her life. And Dora also plays a really important role in terms of the relationship with Sarah's daughter, with Bette, which I think is really valuable. And I didn't think about her as I was writing her necessarily as an alter ego for Sarah, but it is important when you write fiction to have contrast between characters, to have characters who are really kind of distinctive and different from each other. And at the same time, and the other thing that happened in the writing of the novel was that Dora initially was just in one small section of the book, but when people read the manuscript, they'd say, "Oh, what happened to Dora? I really like Dora. Like, why doesn't, you know, what's with Dora? Like, why do you?" So I ended up writing a lot more. I ended up writing Dora much more into the novel than perhaps she was in the first version of the book, because I could see that she had a valuable role in the book as a whole.
She serves so many purposes in the book, with you know, untangling different themes, and also just giving that juxtaposition of two different types of way to be a woman at that time as well. So no, I loved her. She was a great character. Sarah's life as an unmarried mother is often decided by charity and good luck. She accepts offers from people, mainly men, when she knows she should say no, because they are, and this is in her words, the light from above. And when you've lived for 26 years as Sarah Francis, it's best to accept what's handed to you. I just wondered if you could speak to this observation of Sarah has of herself and of her life. It's almost quite fatalistic, isn't it?
It is, but I also think that what's interesting, well, I guess with Sarah's character, I was also interested in remembering and portraying what it's like to be somebody with very few means. And it's not that I had a very privileged upbringing and life, but, you know, there were times where I didn't necessarily, you know, when I was relying on my own kind of income and so on as a young person. And I think it is when you don't have much financially, then it is quite difficult to view the world in any other way, but it being, you know, but taking what you can, not necessarily from men, but, you know, in terms of like just being grateful for whatever financial resources you can obtain. I was interested in trying to write a character who was really came from quite a kind of pinched, deprived, not entirely deprived, but a background where she just basically doesn't have a lot of money. And once she's in Australia, she doesn't have much in the way of family resources to fall back on either. And so therefore her options are actually really quite limited in terms of what she can obtain. She gets jobs, but she's not like Dora, who has a profession. You know, she's a nurse, she has a regular income. Sarah has not had a job up to that, you know, she's not had a properly, well, I suppose she works a little bit for Isaiah, but she hasn't had a paid job really until she gets to Australia, and then she's really worried about whether she can even get one. And so that sort of whole doubt about, and financial insecurity, that whole doubt about being able to sort of survive in the world and also look after a child,
She's stronger than she thinks, I think.
Yeah, she is, but it's
she's fierce.
Yeah, she is. Yeah.
Certainly in her relationship sometimes as well. There's some wild animals feature in this book so much, as does wild landscapes. But Sarah sees biblical horses and absorbs Isaiah's sermons about the 7-horned lamb. And as a child, she then releases an orphan fox. As an adult, she refers to herself as being like a little rabbit, wishes she could live in an apartment several stories up like a bird, saves an injured magpie and then goes on to rescue wild animals. And this thread of wildness and animals is just threaded right through the story. And Bette says of Sarah, this is what Sarah longed for again and again, to set a bird or a kangaroo or a possum loose, to give it back to the world. And I want to ask, is it that Sarah believed she could only love animals well, not her daughter or other people?
I think the relationship with her daughter is really complicated, because she's had so many sort of traumatic experiences that they get in the way a little bit of being able to kind of love as completely as perhaps she'd like to. But at the same time, there is a sense, I think, in the book and in Sarah's feelings about animals around the fact that our relationships with wild animals are already quite compromised. Like, we're already sort of, the magpie falls out of a nest, of course, but it's at risk of cats. So there's already this sort of compromised environment. And in a way, her attempts to look after wild animals are to sort of make up for that, for what humans are doing. It's a sort of it's only a halfway solution, but it's better than nothing in a way, to kind of to do what you can to give animals back kind of to the world, or to make a space for them so they can thrive. And the magpie, my mum's here and she'll remember that I had a magpie that fell out of a tree. Like, there's not much that's very autobiographical in the book at all. So, for example, the parents in the book are totally unlike my parents. But there was a magpie that fell out of a tree that I rescued, and I tried to sort of raise. We took it to the vet. We did all kinds of things to try and help the magpie, but in the end, the magpie died. My mother has, she can tell, I don't know, she has a different story about how it came to die for me. But in any case, the magpie didn't make it. And so that part of the story about the magpie is partly autobiographical. Yeah. But most of the book is not. And I am actually a qualified veterinarian, and I had friends who are really involved in wildlife care as well.
That's not in your bio.
Oh, isn't it?
I don't think so.
Oh. I don't work as a veterinarian anymore, but yeah. So well, that
explains a lot about Bette's character, I guess, who we're going to talk about a bit more now, because in part 2 of the book we get to know Bette a lot better, even though Bette is telling the story right from the beginning as the all-seeing, all-knowing, omniscient narrator. It's her interpretation of a mother's life, but it doesn't feel like that. It always feels like Sarah's speaking, and so that has been a real, from a crafting perspective, that was a real skill to be able to so seamlessly pull off that shift from Sarah that you write in the third person, and then when we're in Bette's voice, even though it's Bette who's telling the whole story, you shift to the first person for her. And Bette says in the opening paragraph of telling her mother's story, she says, and this is a beautiful sentence, I traverse a tightrope high above the ground and have to fill the empty air beneath so that I can move from one known place and time to another. And I thought, gosh, what an undertaking and what a responsibility to even try and fill that empty air. And I wondered, is this something Bette can do with objectivity and honesty? Is it possible that she focuses only on the negative, seeking blame for her own shortcomings? Is it something any of us can ever hope to do? And to what extent that affected the way you had to write this transition between the mother and daughter?
Yes, I think that in a way that's what the book is partly about for me, is that idea that it's really more a question than a statement. I think a lot of fiction I really admire is more trying to ask questions than trying to make kind of declarative statements about what is and isn't possible. But it was really asking that question about, you know, to what extent is it possible to imagine somebody's life, and what are the issues around that representation. It's a sort of an old debate, you know, around who has the right to write somebody else's life and from somebody else's perspective. And for Bette, I think the motivations are very clear from the beginning. She's doing it partly to get a sense of who she is, but she's also doing it because she wants to recover this lost time of her mother's, in a sense, because there's always this question about your parents. You know, you get these little stories, and as you get older you get more and more fascinated by what their lives were like, and you know, whether you can actually really remember or really access, you know, how they felt about things, or you know, what their existence was like. And so I think, you know, that it's in a way it's asking this question about to what extent can you access somebody else's sort of consciousness, and what are the ethics of that, you know, what are the sort of problems that arise. And one of them is perhaps the one that you've just pointed to, this idea that of course it's going to be partial, because Bette is maybe trying to explain to herself why perhaps she hasn't felt as though she's secure in her mother's affections or whatever. But also I think the other question is, it's a question if you're a fiction writer, but it's also a question in day-to-day life, because you're sometimes trying to work out what people's motivations are, or why they act the way they do. And sometimes when you get just a little hint of a narrative, you cut people a bit more slack sometimes. Certainly in my job, that's been, you know, where you know, we're not here to talk about my job, but you know, where I talk about, you know, I talk to students about whatever issues or whatever they're facing, and once you get just a little bit of their story, you often, it's very, you know, you feel differently about maybe how they've acted, or the fact they haven't handed their essay in, or you know, that kind of thing. So I think
another piece of the puzzle.
Yeah. So I think it's a question for fiction writers, but it's also a question in daily life. You know, you're constantly trying to kind of work out why people are doing what they're doing, and it often involves an act of an imagination on your part, and what are the ethics of that? Like how can you do that in a way that is you know, kind and acknowledges what's
fair.
Yeah.
So love is such a big part of this story, whether that be familial love or the love of others, such as friends or partners. But for both Sarah and Bette, love feels like this eternal search, but also a burden at times. And like her faith, Sarah gives up on it often, certainly with others, and sometimes with Bette too, which is part of the things that Bette is trying to work out, this affection of her mother's. And Sarah says of love, it makes you vulnerable, traps you under glass. But later in the story, she questions her expectations of it and asks herself, is there a way to make love ordinary, everyday, even boring? And then Bette says of her mother, sometimes it feels like love is too big a thing for Sarah to hold or manage. And I maybe think deep down, is real love or big love in Sarah's mind reserved only for God? Is that another part of the expectation of her faith that she can't be freed from? Or is it a trust or something else altogether that prevents her from finding and keeping love?
Yeah, so I think I think that's the other question the book is kind of interested in, actually, or one of the other questions, because in some ways love for Sarah equates with oppression, in that most of the relationships that Sarah has with men are not loving in the true sense of the word, perhaps. And so, you know, is love a sort of patriarchal kind of construct, rather than, you know, does it actually exist? And so I suppose that question around you know, around God is really relevant, because that would also mean that she'd be quite, if God is part of that same sort of structure, she'd be quite ambivalent about that form of love. But the forms of love that she does feel are more, empathetic, for animals, really is the kind, and later, she has different, her feelings about it develop as the book progresses, I think, too, so that she does feel capable of certain forms of love. And love, of course, is also integral to all, there's a lot of discussion about love in the Bible, especially in the New Testament. Again, I sound like I'm religious, whereas I'm not. But and also that question of sort of of different kinds of love that comes up a bit in the book too. Yeah, I'm not sure that fully answers your question. Yeah, but that.
Well, I think the whole story, a big part of the story is this examination of what love is, how we show it, and how we receive it. So no, you have answered the question, and there's so much more about it within the story that people will pick up when they read it as well, I think. There's this harrowing scene in the novel, and I'm only mentioning it because the reviews I've read of your book, they mentioned it, so I thought if they can write about this harrowing scene, I will. This harrowing scene in the novel of this newly orphaned foal being draped in the skin of a dead one, with hopes the dead foal's mother will accept the living one as her own and raise it. And now I know that you're a vet. When I read that scene, I've never heard of it before, but I knew it was true because it is so realistically written. So I'm sure it is true. So that makes it even more harrowing. But this scene is a powerful metaphor for identity and but also for honesty. And of course, that always has to bring us back to Bette, I think, because of her conflict with who she is within her body. And I wanted to know how comfortable and honest is Bette in her skin. And I wondered if you could talk to that a little bit.
I think by the end of the novel, more so, or very, I think, I probably shouldn't be saying that, but yeah, I think it, I think it develops over the course of the novel, and that, but a lot of it is around the kind of the different conflicts that arise between Bette and Sarah, and Sarah's strong desire for Bette to have a really straightforward, easy life, which would involve, getting married, having a decent job, having kids, a life that's very different to the life that Sarah's led. And so some of the conflict just arises between Sarah's desire, Sarah's acknowledgement that her mother was not particularly kind to her when she got pregnant as an unmarried mother, and so she wants to do the right thing by her child, but at the same time she is exasperated with her daughter, but about the fact that her daughter won't just behave herself basically, and and be normal. Be normal, yeah. Whereas Bette sort of is really interested, I think, not so much sort of tortured, but she's just interested, as so many people are, in exploring who she is and her sexuality and, and her identity as a person, and to what extent, and is not entirely comfortable with conforming to the sort of norms that her mother would dearly love her to be able to adhere to.
That's it. She evolves throughout that book with such grace, really, when you think about all her upbringing. So I loved her as a character, Bette. She's very complex, well, as they all are. Chrissy, how are we going for time? And have we got some questions? I've got some more here, but I don't want to
We do have a couple of questions here. Hopefully my internet's not going astray at the moment. There's a question from Cass Moriarty, who asks, and she quotes you, "How do I write about a fervour I do not feel?" Bette's question could also be Lucy's question. How did you write, Lucy, about Sarah's passion so intimately without being religious yourself?
Yeah, I think I have to just hand it to the good book. Just a lot of Bible reading. No, I didn't actually. I don't know. I'm just trying to think. I suppose I'm actually really interested in spiritual, in people who are able to have deep spiritual faith of different varieties, because it's just it seems from my vantage point to be a very comfortable place to be somewhere where you can believe in things. The book is called Believe in Me. So, and I'm interested, like, I think it's really, in some ways, I think it's really important for there to be things that you can and can't do, in terms of, like, best not to kill other people, or that kind of thing, which is an important part of religion, having that sort of moral code, or that ethical code. And at the same time, I am really fascinated by people who can believe in things that you can't see necessarily, like as in God. I don't know if that answers your question very well. But yeah, I think also just on a practical level, just spending, I did find the Bible a very rich resource in terms of both the language and also the crazy stuff that's in there, especially in the Old Testament, which I had not, as a sort of somebody who was raised as sort of watered down Anglican, I had not really encountered or engaged with.
You use them with great strength in the novel as well. They're the biblical verses that you include are just sort of round off scenes, often in really astute ways.
Thank you.
Have you had any feedback from people who are religious to the book yet?
I haven't yet, actually. Yeah, it'd be interesting. Oh no, no, that's not true. I did have an email from somebody who had been raised in a very strict religious family, who said that the book made her realize some things about her relationship with her mother, and which I thought was really interesting, because her mother had also been really religious. So I think for her, on some level, there were aspects of the book that rang quite true for her.
Interesting. There's another question from Cassie, and if anyone else have any questions, please feel free to pop them through on that chat function. Cass has also asked about Dora and Sarah and their relationship, because they sound so different. What draws the two women together as friends?
Yeah, I think it's partly a necessity thing, isn't it, Cass? I don't know if you've read the novel, but it's partly just that Sarah has nobody else, and also has a feeling, I think, also a feeling of admiration and curiosity about Dora, because Dora is so different to anyone she's ever encountered. As she's really Sarah's come out of the Midwest, out of kind of quite a religious family, and to meet somebody whose values are completely different is really interesting to Sarah, and a bit estranging and a bit strange, but also, yeah.
The exotic.
That's it. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, we don't have any other questions from the audience yet, but feel free, if you do, to put them in there.
I would like to ask about some more about the scrapbooks, Lucy. So Sarah has literally got a scrapbook life, really. She over the years, she keeps these books that she documents all her thoughts and people she meets and different events, and she collects fragments from her life that put in there patches of cloth or draws images, words, names, verses, prayer. And I was particularly interested in what purpose they served for Sarah. They certainly helped Bette to come to understand, to get tantalisingly close, I guess, to a mother, but also with the mystery of interpreting these scrapbooks as well. And I wanted to ask you about them. Were they a record of a life, or was it more a compartmentalising of a life by Sarah? And I just wondered if you could speak about the scrapbooks a little.
Yeah, I wished I could reproduce the scrapbooks as part of the novel. It would have been really fun to have.
Oh, wouldn't it? Yeah.
More of the scrapbooks actually in the novel. yeah, but that's sort of beyond my skill level, really, to be able
I'm
to be able
sure.
to do that. But I think also the scrapbooks were about, and certainly this is how Bette interprets them, and I guess we have to kind of listen to Bette here because Bette's the authority. But the scrapbooks are sort of a reflection, really, of Sarah's inner life, or aspects of Sarah's inner life, which perhaps so they not so much an ideal life, but perhaps, you know, more about what she was thinking or feeling at various moments, and how that, and or desired or wanted. So a lot of longing in the scrapbooks, I think. Whereas, and so therefore they are quite a good avenue for Bette to use to kind of try and uncover or unpick what was going on with her mother.
There's that scene where she cut, I think she's had a blueberry pie, and she spills some on a shirt, and she cuts the fabric out of her shirt because it occurred at a time that, at an occasion that wasn't a good occasion. And it almost felt like, right, I can cut that off my body. That's a stain that was put on me that I can take away, and I'm putting in a compartment over here. And so it just, and I know it's open to Bette's interpretation what that piece of blueberry stained cloth is, but as a reader, it was just so much you could take away from the scrapbook. So I thought they were a really fantastic device, I guess, for the want of a better word. So really,
and she's of a time, she's of a kind of time and demographic, I guess, who would use the scrapbook. I would actually like to use scrapbooks as a sort of writing process tool. I think they could be. In the Charlotte Wood book on writing, you know, where she interviews all these writers, I think she talks about a particular writer who uses scrapbooks, not scrapbooks, but who uses kind of collections of ephemera and images and so on to generate her books. And I'm trying to remember who that was, but I just thought, I wish I could do that. You know, that'd be so great. It might have been I mean Joan London, but I might be making that up, actually. Yeah. I might be completely making that up. I can't remember who it was, but I thought, that'd be a great way to write. But I'd probably spend my whole time sticking stuff into notebooks and not actually, you know, writing, which wouldn't be so great.
You'd spend time on the collecting.
On the collecting, and not the actual writing the novel.
Fantastic way to procrastinate, I believe. I have another question here, if you want. So there's a question from Jean, which was, what was your intention with Isaiah losing his sight? I found this really interesting, as it made me feel for a character I'd recoiled from until then.
I think I actually, unfortunately, that I don't have a very good answer for you, Jean, except that I did know this guy who was really creepy and who did have that same issue, that and so in a way, and it was somebody I met sort of probably in my early 20s, and so in a similar way, I had very mixed feelings to this person who was married with 3 small children and who did, you know, try to convince me to do something with him. And the same, I had the same kind of strange sort of, you know, repellent, recoiled, but at the same time, I felt really deeply sympathetic actually towards him. And so I think, weirdly, that's a little, I guess I just got that from an autobiographical experience, and I must have just put it in the book. Anyway.
Sometimes his blindness felt willful.
Yeah, that's true. It was a sort of one of those things where, I mean, it is what he has is one of those conditions which is genetic, but which develop, you know, worsens sort of when you're in the prime of your life, sometimes, depending on what variety of it you have, retinitis pigmentosa. And so I think that would be a really difficult experience. Gail Jones's novel, I think it's The Death of Noah Glass. She also has a character with that condition in it. And I realized that, you know, she I'm friends with her and she was reading it, but then I realized later that we'd independently used the same sort of condition, very different character, very sympathetic male character. Yeah.
And have you, if there's no more questions there, Chrissy?
Not at the moment, no.
Because I would, I'd love to hear you read just a short passage to.
I'll just read from the beginning. Okay. Thank you all for coming and for sticking with the Zoom until, for almost an hour, because I know it's like, yeah, it's not the same as if I was at wonderful Avid.
Yes, the wine drinking is more lonely.
Yeah, I know. So thank you all for coming, and I'll read you just a little bit. I would like to write down the portions of my mother's story that I know, but I'm not sure exactly what happened to her in the year before I was born. At times, the anecdotes she told about her life make sense. At others, I traverse a tightrope high above the ground and have to fill the empty air beneath so that I can move from one known place and time to another. The story of my mother begins 30 years ago, in 1974, the year before I was born. This was when, in Australia, a human skeleton estimated to be at least 40,000 years old, sprinkled with ochre and buried with ceremony, was uncovered in the shifting sands around a dry lake bed. In that year too, Philip Bette made 8 passes across the high wire, strung between the Twin Towers in New York, wearing flares that looked wide enough to trip him. My mother's name was Sarah. If I can inhabit her consciousness, even a little, it might help me see who I am. Imagine that I'm creating a reversible figure. Within a silhouette of a candlestick, for example, there lies hidden the profiles of 2 lovers. Sarah is the candlestick. To make her as true to life as possible, I'll use her scrapbooks, which are filled with overlapping pictures and souvenirs and notes. I can also draw on memory. I'm living in Sydney, Australia in 2004, and I need to walk towards the future without always looking back. Sarah was insulated from the assumed freedoms of the 1970s. No one at her church said that she couldn't show her thighs, but she apprehended the message without being told. Back then, she lived in Poughkeepsie in upstate New York, but was too young to go to Woodstock in 1969, and so missed hearing the words to Jefferson Airplane's White Rabbit about how one pill could make you bigger and another could make you small. The lyrics might have aided her in a metaphysical way. They might have helped her to see beyond the strictures of her daily life. Music was important to her. Before she left her hometown, she hummed "Jesus Never Broke My Heart" as she walked in the woods at the back of her house. She said goodbye, goodbye to the trees, birds, and all the animals hiding in plain sight. Could she have really done this? Was she so naive, so trusting? She was already 18 years old. Okay, I'm going to stop there. And I wish I could sing Jefferson Airplane's White Rabbit to you, like just a little bit, or even Jesus Never Broke My Heart, but I'm sorry. Yeah.
That was beautiful. I'm so glad you got to read, because it gives everybody a real sense of the quality of the writing in this book. So we've talked a bit about the story and the characters, but it was just a real joy to hear you read from that, Lucy.
It's beautiful, beautifully written. Yeah.
Thanks.
I think it's been a fascinating conversation tonight. Sally, you did a fantastic job, as you always do. It's very sad that we couldn't host you here at Avid Reader, but when things open up and things travel, we can hopefully find a way to get people together who missed out on the pleasure of kind of meeting in person and meeting readers. I'd love to see a series of parties with writers who we've just met on Zoom and have never had the chance to meet in person, which would be really fantastic if we could.
Yeah, we could have some panels or something. I think it'd be really fun. Yeah. Thank you so much, Sally, for your questions. They're just really wonderful questions. And thanks for sort of plotting our journey so carefully. Hopefully it looked like there was no kind of architecture involved, but let me tell you that Sally really helped me out here. And thanks so much for hosting, Avid, and Chrissy for being here. Yeah.
Thanks very much.
For this beautiful book, Lucy. Everyone go out and get a copy. Honestly, it's one of the most unique books I've read for a long time. It's glorious.
Fantastic.
you.
Wonderful. Congratulations and see you all later. Bye.
Bye. Bye.